Today we'll start talking about the Revolutionary War, as you can tell. But before we actually get to the Revolutionary War, there are some things that we need to discuss. There are things that we need to talk about because, like most events in history, it's not just a singular thing. Like most events in history, the the Revolutionary War is preceded by other events, things that happen that build up and cause the Revolutionary War. What do you think caused the Revolutionary War? People didn't want to be part of England anymore, but there's a reason why. So we have to go back even further. Were they just tired of being English? Taxes had something to do with it.
Freedom.
So, taxes did have to do with it, but there are more things than just taxes. And so we're going to begin really about the time that Georgia becomes a royal colony. Things start happening that lead us to the American Revolution that starts in 1775. So roughly 24 years after Georgia becomes a royal colony, things are happening that caused the revolution, and we're going to begin to look at those things. War breaks out, but the question is, which war? It's not the one you're thinking about. That doesn't happen for another 12, 13 years after this one. There is tension in North America. There is tension between three different countries. What are those countries? England, France, and Spain. So if I walk over here to MJ and I hand her one end of my little rubber thing and I walk away from her, what happens to it? It gets tighter. It becomes tense, right? There's tension. We could play a note. Okay? And if I do that long enough and I get further and further away from her, what's going to happen to it? It's going to break. She's going to cry. I'm going to cry. Life is going to be hard for both of us. We'll have red marks all over our hands and arms. Okay? So there is tension between all three countries, really, but it comes to a head when England and France go to war. And that's kind of the surprise. We haven't talked much about France. But as we move away from the 1750s, France becomes more and more engaged and involved on the North American continent. And finally, England and France go to war. And it's all over land. That's why they're fighting. Boop. It's called the 7 Years' War in Europe because it's recognized as starting in 1756, ending in 1763. That's 7 years. Do the math. So the 7 Years' War in Europe. And it is, in America, it's really about one particular portion of land, and that is the Ohio Valley. You might hear it referred to as the Ohio River Valley. It's fertile. It also the Ohio River leads to the Mississippi River. And so there's access to the Mississippi River through the Ohio Valley. Very important. And they are in dispute. They are arguing. They end up going to war over this portion of land. In America, because the Indians sided with the French, it is known as the French and Indian War. And technically it lasts 9 years, from 1754 until 1763, which is 9 years. We're not going to say much about the French and Indian War. Nothing happens in Georgia. There's no battle. There's no concern. There are probably people living in Georgia that don't even know there's a war going on and never knew it. And so we're going to spend very little time. We're going to watch a 3-minute and 16-second video. We're going to talk about what ends the French and Indian War. We're going to talk about the aftermath, and we're done with the French and Indian War. You'll get a lot of it in U.S. history, maybe even world history. So let's watch our video. Got to watch a commercial or 6.
10 hours studying with this Chrome extension. But no, by all means.
There we go. Not too bad.
From the very beginning, colonialism in America meant competition. European countries were eager to gobble up as much land as possible in the New World. Sometimes this competition turned into open warfare, and the French and Indian War is a perfect example of this. Here's a crash course of 5 things about the war to get you up to speed. North America was a big, beautiful place full of endless opportunities, and Great Britain and France each wanted a piece of the action. The British controlled their 13 colonies and were looking to expand west. The French occupied Canada and were looking to expand south. It was inevitable that they bump into each other, and that's exactly what happened in the Ohio River Valley, an important trading area with access to the Mississippi River. The French and Indian War marked the debut of 21-year-old George Washington, a lieutenant colonel for the militia in the British colony of Virginia. In 1754, he was ordered to protect a British fort near what is now Pittsburgh. On the way, Washington encountered a French military unit, and the two sides fought in the first battle of the French and Indian War, the Battle of Jumonville Glen. Washington was young, but he was quickly gaining the experience he would need to eventually command the Continental Army. Years of territorial scuffles turned into full-blown declarations of war in 1756. As fighting broke out, the British and French sought allies among the local Native American populations. The French were familiar with many tribes through trade and recruited the Potawatomi, Winnebago, Ojibwa, Mississauga, and the Huron, while the British turned to the Iroquois Confederacy. At first, the French were winning a lot. They simply had more troops and better supplies than the British Army and drove them back toward the 13 colonies. But the tide turned in 1757 when British Secretary of State William Pitt took control of the war effort. Dreaming of a vast British Empire, he made it his mission to defeat the French in North America, pouring in generous funds to beef up military resources on the ground. The war ended with the French defeat at the Battle of Quebec and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The British gained control of Canada and all land east of the Mississippi River. It may seem that the British made out well after all was said and done, but there was a catch. You see, William Pitt borrowed heavily to finance the French and Indian War, which left his nation in tons of debt. To make up for it, the British taxed American colonists up the wazoo. Americans didn't particularly appreciate this. Years of protests, rallies, town hall meetings, and petitions would eventually lead to the American Revolution and the creation of the United States. The French and Indian War may not have had the glorious battles or fearless heroes of other great conflicts, but it was one of the most consequential wars in American history. It also opened the eyes of a young military leader to the tyranny of the British, a man who would go on to be the first American president.
All right. So that's it. No more about the French and Indian War. Pretty understandable as to why. It just doesn't have a tremendous impact on Georgia. And again, I doubt that many people actually knew, people outside the government knew there was a war taking place because it just did not impact the colony. So this is what we had during the French and Indian War. If I can get you to look at it. The French and Indian War. Most of the fighting, in fact, all of the fighting took place north of Virginia. And you would think over a 6-year period, 7-year period, you would have more battles than that. But they didn't fight during the winter. It's too cold. It's too hard to travel. So they camped and waited for the spring thaw. And so you didn't have a lot of battles. You look at the Revolutionary War, and it's pretty much the same length. And again, you don't have as many battles as you would think. So what ends the French and Indian War is the Treaty of Paris, 1763. And it is important that you know the date. The Treaty of Paris of 1763, because there is another Treaty of Paris in the 18th century. It's the Treaty of Paris of 1783. This one ends the French and Indian War. 83 ends the American Revolution. Under the Treaty of Paris, France gives up all of its North American colonies, every last one of them. France is no longer on the North American colony. Spanish Florida is given to England, and that's significant because now they do not have to worry about being invaded from the south. They don't have to worry about Spanish Florida anymore. And if you'll remember, Spanish Florida was a refuge for who? Slaves. Suddenly the Spanish aren't there anymore. So those slaves that had found their freedom, in many cases, have it taken away from them again. And even though the war is fought really hundreds and hundreds of miles from Georgia, it still has an impact on the colony. It becomes bigger, and we've talked about that. Its borders change. They expand south to the St. Mary's River. If you look down at the southern border between Florida and Georgia, you see that little hump that sticks down. That's formed by the St. Mary's River. So that becomes the southern border of Georgia. It expands west to the Mississippi River. That doesn't happen until 1764, but it's a part of the Treaty of Paris of 1763. And then finally, and this says one thing, but I really meant another. It says it expanded north to around Augusta. Well, that's not very far north. It actually extends to what is now the Tennessee border, roughly. So the Treaty of Paris actually benefits the Georgia colony, even though it had nothing to do. Now, who is the governor of Georgia in 1763? John who? He was the first. He was the second. James Wright. And James Wright takes credit for expanding Georgia's boundaries. And he had a great idea, right? What are we going to do with all this land? Who are we going to send out there? Farmers with their slaves. To do what? To farm, to improve the economy of the colony. The only problem is he's not allowed to do it. Even though Georgia has land all the way to the Mississippi River, they're not allowed to utilize it. They're not allowed to use it. We'll find out why in just a few minutes. So here's what Georgia looks like after 1764. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see it covers what is today Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And it stays that way till about 1800. And then something happens that's it's a very dark day in Georgia history, and we'll learn all about that in a couple of weeks. That is the Treaty of Paris. That's the cover page for it. It's written in what language? French. Why French? Okay, it was written in Paris, but the two parties to it both speak English as their primary language. So why French? So they won't understand it? No. French was actually the universal language. In other words, there were many people all around the world that spoke French. And so when countries came together to negotiate or to talk, they would use French, the French language. They would speak it and they would write it. And so that's why the Treaty of Paris is written in French, because it was the universal language. What's the universal language today? English. Mandarin Chinese is a close second. followed by Spanish, I would imagine. All right, so the Treaty of Paris, 1763. And here we have our before picture on the left. France, you can see, takes up a lot of land to the west, actually most of Canada. Spain has Texas, Mexico, California, and Florida. And then Great Britain has this. And this is what they're fighting about. That red and blue striped area. This would be the Ohio River Valley. Okay? And that's what the dispute is. After the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain gets everything east of the Mississippi River up into Canada and including all of Canada. Now, Canada that had been explored, no one had ever been there. So they didn't know what was there. But Great Britain gets all of that. Spain gets what had been part of France. And some of you are asking yourself a question. Smoke? I can see it coming out of your ears. And the question is this, but Colonel Seagraves, didn't Thomas Jefferson buy all of that land from the French? So the question becomes, how did France regain custody or ownership of that land? And that's a question that we'll ask a little later. And the other question might be, why did Spain get all of that land? What William Pitt did, we saw it in the video just a minute ago. He went into debt to enable England to win the war. The thing about debt is you had to pay it back. And so part of that might have been to pay back Spain. Another reason may have been Spain agreed not to enter the war to help France. And so in return, they got the land that used to belong to France. Anyway, based on what we learned, who won the French and Indian War? Who won the French and Indian War? Well, if the French won, why did they lose all that land? Who won? The British, Great Britain, England won the French and Indian War. All right, some true-false questions for you. England did not care if France had colonies in North America. Is that true or false? It's false. Of course they cared. That's why they're fighting. Number two, Spain was England's biggest rival for dominance in North America. It's false. Who are they fighting? France. Number three, the Indians sided with France in the French and Indian War. That's true. That the majority of the Indians in North America that were involved sided with France. Did England have any Native Americans side with them? Yes. Florida became English territory through the Treaty of Paris of 1763. That's true. Number five, France won the French and Indian War. It's false. The French and Indian War was known as the 7 Years' War in Europe. True. And then finally, France gave up just one colony in the Treaty of Paris. That is false. All right, good. So, on the heels of the Treaty of Paris 1763 comes the Proclamation of 1763. And the Proclamation is put out by Parliament, by the British Parliament. It had two main goals. I don't want to say it's its primary goal, but it certainly is an important goal, is to avoid conflict with the Indians. England has just come out of a war that was 7 years long. It has cost them 140 million pounds, just think dollars, in debt. And they don't want to fight anymore. It's too expensive. They certainly don't want to fight a war that's 2,000 miles from home. And so the Proclamation of 1763 has that as one of its goals. The second one is to maintain and build the colonies east of the Appalachian Mountains. Why? Because it's easier to trade with England if you're on the east side of the mountains. You're closer to the ocean. You're closer to the port cities. You don't have to climb over the mountains to get there. And so that's the goal of the proclamation. What did it say? It said this. It said that if you were a colonist, a British colonist, you could not settle land west of the Appalachian Mountains. And if you had already done so, you had to come back. You have to live east of the Appalachian Mountains. No choice. So just imagine, you've been living west of the Appalachian Mountains for 10 years. Proclamation of 1763 comes out, and guess what? You got to pack up the wagon and move. You got to leave everything you've built and come back to the east. Why did they do that? Well, that's the second provision of this proclamation, so that they can give that land to the Indians. So basically what happens is the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River becomes Indian territory. Why do they do that? Because they don't want to fight with the Indians. Mm-hmm. And here is the Proclamation Line of 1763. You can see Maine all the way down through Georgia, really all the way to the southern border of Georgia. Is where people could live, in that dark gray areas where colonists could live. The light gray area to the left, they can't live there. That's Indian land, or it's called the Indian Reserve. You can see several different Native American nations: the Iroquois, the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Cherokee, the Creek. There would have been others: the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Mohicans, the Winnebago. A lot of different folks would have been living there. All right, just a different view. You can see the original 13 colonies and the part of France, or excuse me, the part of Canada that France or that England controlled. And you can see what they picked up. The pink had all been French. And then you can see Spain as well, what they were and what they gained. All right. So, because of the French and Indian War, there's a lot of change that takes place on the North American continent. Remember, conflict always leads to what? Change. All right. So how does Georgia react to being told you cannot live west of the Appalachian Mountains? How does Georgia react to this proclamation? It's right there in your notes. Let's see if you can read. Not too bad. Okay? Why is it not too bad? It's quite simply, Georgia's still really young. They're only 30 years old in 1763. People have been living there as colonists for 30 years. And because of that, most of them still live near the coastline. If you remember, a couple of weeks ago, we put out that population density map that was 1776, and it showed that most people, not just in Georgia, but in all the colonies, lived near the coast. But it was particularly true in Georgia. So they're not worried about moving west. Nobody lives there but the Indians. And in fact, in 1803, 40 years after this proclamation, Milledgeville is founded right here, and this is the wild, wild west. This is the frontier. There are still Creek Indians running around. So people just didn't move west. Nobody lived west of the Oconee River. And so there's no reason to be upset. And they benefited. They benefited. They gained land. Even with the proclamation, they now have more land than they used to have. They get resources from Spain. They get resources from the Native Americans. All right. Now, that's it. No more French and Indian War. No more Treaty of Paris, no more proclamation. Now we get into some things that happen that really begin to escalate this divide that develops between the British and their colonies in the Americas. Again, if you paid attention to the little video, you learned that William Pitt puts England into debt, the tune of let's just say $140 million. It's a lot of money in the 1760s. That's a lot of money today. And England has to pay it back. Well, in order to pay it back, England begins to assert more control over the colonies. You've got to pay us. You've got to pay these taxes. And Parliament actually believes that the colonists should help pay the cost of the French and Indian War. And honestly, that's not an irrational thought. That's actually fair. The colonists benefited from the French and Indian War. They should help pay for it. And honestly, I don't think the colonists are real upset about that fact. Nobody wants to pay taxes, but it's understood. You have to pay taxes. And so England began taxing the colonies. One such tax was called the Stamp Act, or the law that created the tax was the Stamp Act. 1765, so 2 years after the war's over, the treaty's been signed, the Stamp Act goes into effect. And what it did is it required colonists to buy a stamp for almost every paper document that they would use. Now, it's not like you go to the post office and get a postage stamp and lick it and stick it on there. What they actually had to do was use paper that had been manufactured in England that had a stamp affixed to it in England. And then if they bought a newspaper, they bought a deck of playing cards. If they went to their lawyer and had a will drawn up, or they went to the courthouse and got a license to be married or a license to start a business, everything that was paper had a tax on it. If you think about yourself for just a minute, what if you had to pay a penny tax for every piece of paper you used on a daily basis? Yep. Again, they're not that upset about the tax. What they're upset about is this. They're paying taxes and they're not being represented in Parliament. And so the phrase, no taxation without representation, comes out. We don't mind paying taxes, but if we're going to pay taxes, you have to give us representation in Parliament. That would be like a group of people in the United States who pay taxes but have no representation in Congress. Is there a group of people like that in the United States? What do you think? Obviously there is, or I wouldn't have asked the question. So yes, there is. Washington, D.C., U.S. citizens, they pay taxes, they pay federal income tax, they pay Social Security tax, just like people that live in Montana do. The difference, people in Montana have representation in Congress, people in Washington, D.C. do not. So it's the same thing, no taxation without representation. If you're not going to allow us to be a state, or if you're not going to give us representation in Congress, you shouldn't tax us. And they have a valid argument, I think. If you go to Washington, D.C. today, you find this license plate. People are upset about it. Taxation without representation. And again, justifiably so. Let me give you another example of how that might work and how unfair that might be. And I'm just going to pick a year in the 60s. In 1968, Vietnam is going strong. The war in Vietnam has been going on for quite a while. It'll go on for quite a while longer. There are roughly 58,000, a little more than 58,000 men and a few women who end up being killed in the Vietnam War. Many of them were 18 years old. They got drafted because they turned to 18. The voting age at the time was 21. Legal drinking age at the time was 18. And as the war dragged on, those who were being drafted to go and fight in this war realized there's something wrong here. I can't vote, but yet there are people in Congress who authorized the draft who are sending me to fight in this war. But I can't vote. I have no voice. I have no say-so. I can go get drunk, but I can't vote. And so in the early 70s, the United States passed a constitutional amendment that lowered the voting age to 18. I personally think it ought to go back to 30. 30. Because I don't know many 18-year-olds who have really paid attention to the facts, who've really paid attention to what's going on. They vote, oh, he looks nice. She sounds good. 21 would be fair, but even then, I didn't know anything when I was 21 years old. That is a. Oh, I had the opportunity to know. Yeah, I didn't know nearly what I know now, certainly. And you don't know what you're going to know when you're 30. I mean, you're going to understand. You're going to have a better understanding of the issues. You're going to have a better understanding of how government works or how government's supposed to work. And when you vote, hopefully you have done your research. You know what a person stands for. Instead of looking at him and going, well, he looks like me, so I'm going to vote for him. People do it all the time. People do it. You know, I typically don't look at party politically. I look at the person. And we had a guy on campus here this week. He and his wife. He's a Republican. He's running for U.S. Senate. And he's African American. Now, if I based my vote on what he looked like, I wouldn't be able to vote for either Democratic or the Republican candidate because they're both going to be black. They're both going to be African American. Raphael Warnock and Kelsey King. Mm-hmm. So what I've got to do, because I've never voted based on what a person looked like, but I've got to vote based on what they believe, what they stand for, what their platform's going to be. So I don't know how we got off on that, but oh yes, I do. So the other thing, if we're not going to raise the voting age, then you have to pass a basic course in citizenship and what it means to be a citizen. Not necessarily, but something similar. But that's illegal, and we're never going to do that. Probably shouldn't do that. But anyway, all right. So if you're printing a newspaper, you have to buy paper that has been made in England, brought over. You have to buy it, and then you can print your newspaper because you're going to pay the tax. A lot of papers just said, we won't print our paper. Or we will print our paper on illegal paper. We'll print our newspaper on paper that we get illegally. We're not going to pay the tax. Georgia had one newspaper at the time. One. And it ceased publication. This is a drawing that was found in the Pennsylvania Journal and Advertiser. It says an emblem of the effects of the stamp. Oh, the fatal stamp. In other words, you're killing us. You're killing us with these taxes. Stop it. And of course, Great Britain didn't. They eventually did. This is what that stamp might look like. This is an embossed stamp. It was pressed into the paper. And then in 1766, it doesn't last long. In 1766, the Stamp Act is repealed. This was a cartoon in an English newspaper. And I think it is absolutely hilarious because of one thing that's happening. No. What? The dog peeing on the preacher's leg. Here. Okay. Why is the dog peeing on the preacher's leg? Because this is Dr. W. Scott, and he is one who spoke out in favor of the Stamp Act. Yes, we need to do that. So, with that bit of knowledge, armed with that bit of knowledge, is this a cartoon in favor of the Stamp Act or against the Stamp Act? Right. And then there are a lot of things in here. The ships back here, Conway, Rockingham, and Grafton, those were 3 members of Parliament who fought to get the Stamp Act repealed. Yes. Right here, it's a casket. Because this is entitled The Repeal or the Funeral Procession of Miss America Stamp. It's the death of the Stamp Act. It was very symbolic. We'll pick up with that on Monday.
I didn't see none of y'all getting invited.